I'm really honored and super happy to be here, invited by Sociocracy for All. Maybe just a little bit to my background. I've been in organizations development and leadership development for over 2 decades, and driven by the ever entrepreneurial, there has to be a better way. About, say, 13 years ago, after discovering that the work I was doing in systemic organizations development was blissfully useless, is what I tend to say. And then started to search for a different way, ran into sociocracy, holacracy. So at that time, holacracy was still pretty new. Sociocracy had been doing the pathfinding preparation work for a very long time already. And sort of stepped into self-organization. I have to say, in this community, my experience is mostly based on holacracy, but I have been working in the sort of teal field for a very long time. And I enjoyed a conversation I had with Ted to see they're not that different than many people like to think. So before I go into presentation mode, just my language tends to be more more holacracy prone than sociocracy prone. I bid for your understanding for that. And I've read through the little booklets that you have on downloads, and I was like, yeah, right, they're not so different. There are some differences, but I don't think they're really that bad that that we can't talk about it. I wish we could do a bit more of that. So anyway, I stepped into that field and very soon experienced some pretty tough times myself in shifting into that world. Excuse me, in shifting into that world. And very soon after I started working in that distributed way, I started to sense into what might be missing. And that's already about 10 years ago is when we first started working with, or I started working with Language of Spaces. And since then, so over 10 years working in the self-organizing field, Language of Spaces has evolved. The practices are super mature, and I've taken hundreds, really literally hundreds of people through the prep processes that we will touch on today. And so in 2016, co-founded Evolution at Work that had a very changing history and had been holding the framework of Language of Spaces for a while. And today I'm here together with my partners, João Wakkenagel, who is there, and Floris Hammer from the Netherlands. And we three represent Evolution at Work, and which is holding doing the work for Language of Spaces now. So let me go, and is that enough, Ted? I think, right? So beautiful. Let me go to share screen, and where is that? Here we are. And okay, so what we're going to do today is an introduction. Really, actually, it's a pretty complex issue. I'm going to try and make it approachable and still deep, not too deep, but deep enough to understand. And when we talk about Language of Spaces, so the subtext for Language of Spaces is building capacity for the journey into self-organization. And to start out with, I would like to explain what we mean when we say self-organization, because that is a term that is around a lot. It's mixed up between self-organization, self-management, teal, whatever you want to call it. Everybody understands something different around it, which is the beauty of the field, because it also gives rise to an incredible richness of approaches. But if we speak of self-organization, we like to be clear on what we mean. And to go directly to a definition, self-organization to us is not a way to do business. It's not a way to set up a company. Actually, the self-organization, from our understanding, goes up onto a completely different level. And I would like to kind of point towards the Big Bang, if you want to. Ever since the Big Bang, if we see what happened since the Big Bang and where we are today, all this happened self-organized. So the evolution of the universe is a self-organized process that we see today in nature, and we are part of nature. And so generally the dynamic, the evolution of the universe is based on self-organization. And is that what allows evolution to happen? And so again, self-organization is the evolutionary principle of the universe. And that's how we understand it. And then we can go deeper into, what people like Friedrich Capra with systems theory and so on. That's all gets very academic then. But holding this simply that self-organization is that what drives the evolution of the universe. And when we take a look at nature and at organic structures, which are an expression of these evolutionary principles, let's take a very simple example. And I am sure a lot of this is not new to anybody here. Here in the room. I'm just trying to make sure that the story is concise, that'll make it understandable of where we're getting. So if we look at a universal structure broken down in an organic system, let's just take 3 different levels, like cells. Cells consist of molecules. Molecules consist of atoms, and so on, and up and down. Unlimited organic hierarchy. And if we look at a cell, like an animal cell, for example, we see the same. It goes up and it goes down, and everything is interconnected, woven together, and functions together. The organizing principles of the evolutionary development are the same, no matter which living system you look at. So if we go and say, okay, we go into an organization, if we go into a structure to do work, we try to mirror these organizing principles, the self-organizing principles. Now, I have a picture here that comes from Sociocracy. This is more like Holacracy would show it, but in general, it's both the same, right? So we use these organizing principles and try to mirror them in our organization. So if we look at it that way, if we look at the structure that I spoke about before, we have a cell, we have molecules, we have atoms, that structure, then we can use this, we can sort of translate that into the cell would be the broadest circle. The molecule would be either in some roles in that circle or an inner circle. The atoms would be the operational roles inside. So we just mirror that organic structure in the way we organize. And mirroring the organic structure is how we hold self-organization while doing work in service of the world and the purpose, in service of the purpose why this organization exists. It has been one of the oldest critiques of self-organization. If you mirror organic hierarchy and the self-organizing principles of nature, that the parts of nature, like we said, cells, molecules, atoms, and all the other parts up and down, are collectively built in a way they're completely clear on what their function is, what their job is, so to speak, and they evolve together in clarity about these functions. What these organic structures don't have are intra and interpersonal psychological dynamics. So most people who don't want to look at self-organization or many people bring this as the critique and say, okay, but people working together have completely different dynamics. Yes, they do. And social systems do consist of complex relationships and interactions, and the dynamics of intra and interpersonal stuff that is going on. And those dynamics need different processes to deal with what is coming up. If we mirror, and that is where Language of Spaces started, if we mirror organic structures and the dynamics of self-organized organic structures and build processes to try and mirror that, but actually we have a system that consists of that and something else, the social dynamics, then we need answers that will serve both these possibilities. And that's what gave rise to the Language of Spaces. The foundational principle where Language of Spaces started is to actually understand that it is important to, if we want to work in a structure that mirrors nature and the functionality of nature, it is important to understand that there is an organizational and structural perspective, and there is a personal perspective on whatever is going on. And those perspectives differ. They're never, ever separate, but they differ. They are differentiated. And so I'm jumping a huge jump forward. And that means I would like to invite you to go into the thought experiment that we have been doing for 10 years now. And that is to say, if we have a company, then we have, and we're doing the work in the company. Whilst we're doing this work in a self-organized way, we have processes that mirror the organic process of nature. And we have dynamics coming from an organic process, and we have dynamics coming from a social context, from the collective of the people. And if we say we give this each a home in what we call contexts, we have an organization context and a people context. And if we have concerns or tensions, then we can look at those from different perspectives. It's not, we're always in those perspectives at the same time. We work from our roles, which are a structural aspect, while we interrelate as people at the same time. And that always happens in parallel. Yet when it comes to finding, to resolving tensions or concerns, we need to look at it from the organizational perspective and have different pathways to process that. And we need to look at it from the personal perspective, which again has different processes, brings different information. Together, we look at it as a whole again, we integrate that again, but to reflect, to find necessary pathways and useful pathways, this differentiation is super useful. So how do we define a concern or a tension? And this is more, Ted, we might have a little bit of a conversation about that. I don't know how sociocracy defines that in detail. From the holacracy world, we call it tensions or even concerns. But what the concern or the tension is what I sense, this is how something is, and this is how I would like it to be, or how I think it would be better, how I have a sense that it would be better. And every evolutionary system is driven by tensions. Tensions is what drives development and what drives evolution or concerns, right? And a system that has no tension that drives it forward is a dead system. So coming back to this yellow circle in the middle here, when we have organizational dynamics, and we call that the organization context. The organization context is the structure and the processes that navigate the work that is done in service of the desired outcome, the purpose, the mission, the vision, whatever you want to call it. And in our language, it's always purpose. And in this part here, in the organization context where the structure lives, you have the organizational self-organized dynamics. If you look at the concern from the other perspective, where the collective of the people who work together in service of that desired outcome, vision, mission, purpose, again, too many words, staying with purpose as the highest creative output of a company, you then have completely different dynamics looking at the same concern or tension from a different perspective. In the people context is where you find all these social elements needed for a collective to thrive in service to purpose. And this is where culture lives. The people context is where culture lives. And there are no two social systems that are exactly the same, because every social system develops its own culture and its own way of social dynamic and social being together, both individually and collectively. So when I say reflecting from different perspectives, what we mean, where's the link? So the shape here has changed. Bear with me because I'm going to go into another level of detail. But let's start with the level of simply, it's not that simple, but of reflecting on what is going on from the organizational, the blue perspective. And there is a process that allows us to do that, and a process that has been developed over the past 10 years, as I told you, a set of reflection questions that will hold me as the one holding the tension to a specific perspective, in this case, the perspective of the organization. What does the organization, what does that look like from the organizations, from the structures and decision-making processes perspective? And when I have, and when I'm done with processing, it always ends with defined pathways of how to move this concern or tension towards a solution. Once we've done that, we shift over in the process and we explore and reflect and introspect on the personal and collective perspective of the same concern. And again, those two perspectives are never separated. This is why this is called differentiation and integration. It's just a differentiation of perspective. You reflect on the personal aspect of that concern, and you decide what does it need, what are the next steps, what are the next actions needed in order to move this aspect, the personal and collective aspect of the tension, towards a solution. And then when you have those steps defined, you then take it with you and integrate it back into, of course, the holistic view of what it takes for us to do work together, both organizationally and personally, in service to purpose. So this was the first step. This was what first came out of the exploration and the early development of Language of Spaces. And very soon it turned out that further differentiation can be super useful. And that's when we developed and when it became clear that more granular differentiation even breaks the complexity of the way we work together down into smaller, very good, workable and handleable, is that the word? Workable steps, right? So we start looking at it purely from operations, from the work that we in our roles are doing, the projects, the coordination, the synchronization, whatever we do to move work operationally forward. And once we have reflected on that and decided on what possible next steps can be, we then shift perspective. Again, this is all describing a reflection process. Shifting the perspective to the governance perspective of what does the structure, what structure do we need to govern this aspect of the tension? And once we've went through the detailed reflection of this, we step over into the personal and collective perspective, and we slip out of our role. We leave everything what is sort of organizational behind, and now we look at the deeper personal level, from what does that look on a relational aspect? What is the relational aspect? Because the relational aspect, the expectations that we have as people of each other are different than what we expect of each other when we do work. And those are two things that are running that are running always at the same time and in parallel. And when I've gone through the process with this reflection and said, okay, these are the next steps that I need to do when it comes to the relational aspect, which is the one that kind of reaches into the relational space here. We then step out and shift over into individual space, and every concern or tension has this aspect that is purely ours, the I aspect. I sense it that way because it is me, and then we look at this from this pure I perspective. What are my patterns? What is my part in that, and how can I reflect and possibly learn from that? So, and then when we step out, so we can go back into the middle and see all the steps that I've reflected from each of those perspectives. And then I go back into doing my work and being with my colleagues together and integrating all those steps in those broken down, smaller, concise steps. So this is the bigger description. So we start with just reflecting two perspectives, and then when we've started to learn to differentiate those perspectives, we step into step two to get an even deeper multi-perspective view of an issue going on. So starting with that, language of spaces is based, and the foundational capacity is the differentiation and integration capacity that I just spoke about, how to learn how to differentiate and integrate those perspectives. And from that work, very soon, it became clear that other capacities that then are needed when you have that level of clarity, when you're working on the relational aspect or versus the organizational aspect. Many dynamics become more clear and invite us into more self-responsibility about how to navigate that. We can't hide behind roles, or roles can't neglect relationship. It all becomes transparent through that perspective taking. And over the years, Language of Spaces has become a very holistic framework to learn and to practice the personal capacities. I will go into those capacities briefly a little bit later. I should have shown this one first. So apart from the differentiation and integration capacity, that's which is the one that I spoke about most, then the question of self-realization, of being able to reflect on our own patterns, learn from them, try ourselves out by shifting those patterns or not. And then it's like a sort of a classical sort of developmental spiral. And then also the capacity of inner leadership, of trusting our own intuition in the present moment, the mindfulness and awareness comes in. And then last but in no way least, purpose alignment, which means my capacity to sense proximity and resonance between my personal purpose and the company's purpose, or the entity's purpose that I'm dealing with right here. And understanding that closeness, or sometimes growing apart, is not a question of who do I blame for it, but it's just an evolutionary development. So that was a quick drive through, and I'll maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, but we've prepared some sort of special offers for the Sociocracy community and everybody who gets a hold of these slides, which I will, of course, we will provide you with. So there's a 3-hour webinar that we are planning on inviting specifically people who have an understanding of sociocracy or are sociocracy practitioners. And we have a special promo code here, which will give you a reduced price for that. And there is a certification training to facilitate the process, the reflection process, which is a really deep process of personal development. If you want, which is like a 17-week program in a small cohort of 3 people only, because you facilitate yourself back and forth. But you're going to find all this on the slides, and I am done. I tried to be. I think I did quite good time-wise.
Yes,
so,
you did.
Yeah, I much rather have conversations. I always try to get the slides out of the way as quick as possible. We can't do without, but I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you. Very rich. I am curious how many practices there are connected. Like, can you elaborate more on that? Like the perspective taking, like, let's say I say, okay, I'm gonna ask just a very naive question, okay? I'm aware of that. So I say, yes, I want to do this. How do I go about the perspective taking now?
Okay, so you go to a certified Language of Spaces facilitator. There are some in America, some in Japan, and 2 only here in Europe, of which one am I. But we're going to change that dramatically, and go through a one-on-one session, which, if it's the first one, probably takes 2 hours. The average length of a reflection process is 1.5 hours. But if you're in early times, you need a bit more explanation before and debrief after. So it's a 2-hour process. And you're guided through a very clear set of questions that guide you through the reflection and hold, as a facilitator, I hold you to a specific perspective. And I'm going to be a little bit more specific about this. When I say I hold you, that is that in the, it's called Language of Spaces. In the language through which people answer, you hear if someone is actually talking from role perspective or is talking a lot in I and we, and the language that goes along with it. So as a facilitator, you have to learn to be very clear without being harsh. And sometimes it feels very harsh, but it is very useful to actually hold this perspective. And then the last question of each space that you're taken through is always, so what are the next workable steps that you are going to take, what that you will take? It's more of a commitment to break that down into smaller steps. And then you go into the next perspective, and then you have, again, a set of questions. So, and then if you go through that process 2, maybe 3 times, that starts to you automate, because you learn the usefulness of breaking a big complex problem down into smaller steps that'll keep you moving forward. And you can then start, doing that, you start to do it automatically. And only with the bigger, really bigger ones, you will need to have some help, right? Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. And then my understanding is, you kind of said it, but let me just check whether I understood it correctly. So let's say I take 2 hours to process something with you. So then you help me break down, like, basically the responsibilities on me in all of those 4 spaces, the responsibilities on me to initiate the change, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. I just hold space and ask questions.
Yeah,
right?
No, I don't mean necessarily just, yeah, I know. I was more thinking about where's that membrane between me and the collective behind me in the organization. I find that an interesting one too, like because that happens so often in, for example, performance reviews, and there's 2 things here. There's 2 things that I'm curious about, how you see it. One is, if in my performance review something comes up, it's, since I'm both, since I have such a central role here in my organization, it's typically the case that everything that comes up around me is at the same time an organizational thing. So both because of everybody kind of has that tendency to bake things, like tensions that are within me, I'm going to manifest outside, right? That's a classic. And also, it is often not just in my power to even make the change. I can, of course, initiate it, and that's my responsibility. But it really is a set of collective choices that can lead to any changes. Can you speak to that?
Yes, totally. I mean, that is, okay, how much time do we have? Let me try and make it short. So in evolutionary work, we offer something that we call the symbiotic enterprise. And the symbiotic enterprise is a framework, if you want, that translates what we just spoke about with the language of spaces into the actual defined structure of the people context and the organization context. And one of the core learnings that happens when you implement that framework is you differentiate professional from personal feedback. And that is possible if you learn the DI capacity. And so professional feedback is performance of role work, and personal feedback is performance in relational behavior. And you learn to differentiate that through the language of spaces practice. That's exactly what you are pointing to. Is I mean, I'm sure you experience that, all of us experience that all the time, but that confusion or that mixture of those levels make life really very difficult, especially if you don't have a power hierarchy where in the end somebody says, this is what you're going to do. I don't care, right? Because like you said, it is a collective, right? We have consent decision-making in the organization. And the question is, what is the culture? How does the collective of the people decide around things that are relevant for the social system to be a thriving social system in support of purpose? So that is a really, really big question. How do you, that's where, again, where culture is defined. We do that by developing, in an evolutionary way, developing what we call a social agreement, or in the for-purpose enterprise is called the association agreement. You actually develop collectively, and the purpose is always to form a strong collective, a social system that is carried by care, concern, and compassion, so that this social system can best support collectively while doing the organization, while doing their work together. And then again, working on the differentiation of this is how we process things in the organization, and this is how we process things while we're in the social system. And so it's a really difficult learning step to understand that differentiation, and it is a practice. That's why it's a practice, right? So again, performance review, what does that mean in a symbiotic enterprise or in an organization that works with language of spaces? There's two different kinds of performances. There's professional, role-related, work, operational, and decision-making performances for the work. And there is performance in how do I talk to you? How do I treat you? How do I react when you trigger me? And how can we expect, what behaviors can we expect of each other? Completely different question.
Thank you. I'm going to go shift to the questions in the chat. And you also, this is the moment where I invite things into the chat. So thank you for holding off a little. And now don't hold off anymore. I'm going to take them in the order in which they came. So one was the request to clarify the relational aspect a little bit more. And it says here, the other three feel very clear. Could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. Okay. So part of the process is you work on an organization, let's say the operational perspective of attention or concern that you have. And you reflect on that from, is it about timing? Is it about the quality of the work being done? Is it about synchronizing with others that are concerned? So you reflect on the operational aspects of what is going on. When you shift into personal, you talk about your personal expectations. So very often it starts with, well, he should just do what everybody, or what he should just do what he is supposed to do. Okay, so what exactly do you mean? Well, he doesn't do his work. So, okay, what exactly does that do to us? What is the personal expectation? Do you expect someone to be reliable? Do you want to be able to trust someone? Do you want to be able to speak, to be open to speak about this when it is necessary? Those are all personal expectations. And if very often in the processes, it's like, I don't really know what the other person wants from me. I don't really know how to talk to this person because I don't know what this person really needs from me. And I don't think the person knows what I need from him or he needs from me. So that, then you bring that onto a behavior level where you say, okay, so how would it show up if the other person would behave in a way that you would expect that person to behave? How would that show up? What would that be? How would that be different? And then you drill that down sort of to when you come to the personal relational perspectives. Because if I can't rely on you, the translation often is, you don't take me serious, you don't listen to me, I'm not important to you. All these stuff. So you can already see by what I'm saying that this is where the self-realization capacity comes in. I reflect on my own patterns, and I reflect on how the behaviors of others, what does that actually create in me? And we look at the in-between, at the relational aspect, and not just what do I want or what does the other want. And ultimately, it is, can we expect that of each other? And is it important to the collective or just to our own personal relationship? Does that make sense? The work thing is really easy, okay? So what's your timing? What's your priority? When are we going to hear what the next steps brought? That's easy. But what isn't easy is to practice to get that out of the way. And then there's us, then that's really person-to-person communication. and what we need of each other.
Krishna, are you satisfied with the answer? It was your question.
Yes, I think the next question that Flores and Arbel asked would also help clarify, because maybe then we can see it from each perspective in a specific example, and that might ground it a bit more from the concept.
Can you
Sorry,
help me here?
That question is, could you share an example of attention and the various perspectives? So maybe, yeah, that's.
Oh my, okay, let's say, I'll give one that I experienced recently and someone that I took through the process, okay? And I hope it's okay. This organization is practicing holacracy. I hope that's okay for everybody here. Somebody has a role and is part of the is the circle lead of the general circle of the company circle, and at the same time is in a role to accompany the holacracy implementation. And he's been with this company forever, and they went through the shift. And then there's this one person with whom he has worked since, I think, 10 or 15 years, and they always were really good friends. This person is the only person to be the circle lead of a subcircle of the GC and refuses to practice. It refuses to do meetings, to do holacracy, just says we do our own thing, which disrupts the dynamics in the general circle. And this has been going on for a while. And of course, he would have the autonomy or the authority to take this person out of role, but he can't. Why can't he? Because there's a personal relationship involved. And he is really, really frustrated and also personally hurt because he feels extremely let down by this person. So if you look at it from operational, right, you simply reflect on how are the rules and the processes anchored, and what is the operational consequence if there is a role that isn't performing in a way that makes it possible for self-organization to actually unfold its potential, right? And that's just operationally what is missing, okay? And what are possible operational steps? Maybe, you can request whatever, ask for metrics or whatever is operationally possible. Then you go into the governance perspective. What is missing in the organizational structure and in the organizational processes to navigate that level of that form of attention? So is there an authority anchored in a role through a defined accountability that can actually navigate, monitor the quality of the practice, for example, or through metrics, or navigate and have the authority to actually set steps in order? Normally there is, right? So you have to have some role that is in charge of inviting people in role to taking out of role, right? But you might have a different approach and say, we need an additional authority in the organization to deal with something like that. And you update, you have a consent decision, you propose the update, whatever, integrate objections, that game, right? Then I moved into the relational part, and everything kind of came up of the history between the two and how he was holding back because he didn't want to hurt that person. He had a level of understanding why this other person is like 2 years ahead, has 2 years to go before he retires. And, there's a whole story going on there. And we reflected on that story. And it turned out that he felt really deeply let down by this other person because he, as lead link of the GC and of the one who actually was part of the decision to actually shift into that system, felt completely let down by his friend, and the friendship had really been suffering from that. And then we broke it down into what needs to be clarified. What do you actually really know where the resistance come from? What do you think does he need from you? What do you need from him? And you break it down into that. And then you actually kind of write that down into next workable steps. And then you go to the individual perspective. And in the individual perspective, you reflect on your own behavior patterns that get triggered because of that tension. And in his case, normally there's pretty deep personal reasons, but the process is not to dig deep. It's not therapy, right? You just identify what it is, and then you identify on how would you like to experience yourself differently in this moment, and you go towards activating and anchoring resources for when something like that happens again.
Thank you so much.
Is that useful?
Yes. Okay, I see nodding there. Great.
Okay, thank you. Cool question.
Oh yeah, go ahead. We have a verbal question coming.
Christian, I might say, folks, that I've been taken through this process, and I've observed people being taken through the process, and it's quite needed in the world, and it's very deep and complex. So it's an amazing process. So when Enlivening Edge was setting up as an LLC, we formed the association, and then we asked ourselves what process would we use in the association to resolve tensions. So my question is, you mentioned the social system and the organizational system, and would you use language of spaces in both? Is there, because there are often not roles in the association.
No. Yeah. Thank you. No. So language of spaces, it is completely agnostic towards the processes that are then used to resolve the aspects of attention that it brought forward, right? That it is completely agnostic. It just brings out the aspects of the tension and then leaves it to the system, the organizational system and the social system to find its pathways to process that. If you do sociocracy, you have described processes, and you might do one or the other thing different if you actually work with that differentiation. If you do with holacracy, you certainly need to do one or the other thing different, because as we know, holacracy governs the organization, not the people, which has created a lot of difficulties, right? So now you have a space of where to put it. And a lot of people use nonviolent communication in the people context, but there's appreciative inquiry, different forms of feedback, active listening, and so on and so on. And every social system has to decide what is the suitable methodology for us to give feedback, to resolve processes, to navigate our social systems. We have a template, which kind of is sort of a frame for what has shown as being useful when you put into such a social agreement. But really, that needs to be processed from the social system itself to then you can use the template, but the content needs to arise from the social system. Right. And it's an experiment, like everything in self-organization is. You say, okay, let's do nonviolent communication. If it works, fine. If it doesn't, we have to bring that up. One thing that might be important in this context is that the agreement, the social agreement, is anchored in a role in the so-called integration circle, where the perspectives get integrated, right? Because the organization has a vested interest in the social system being a cohesive, strong system carried by care, concern, and compassion, and resources might be needed for that. So that's how we bridge that. but you do need agreed upon processes in the people context, and that's part of the practice. When you actually differentiate the contexts, you then need a container for how do we get together, when are we actually where, when are we in organization context and in people context, and how do we navigate that, right? Mm-hmm. Because we are actually always in both. It's just a question of saying, okay, now I'm speaking from this perspective, and then I'm speaking from the other perspective.
Yeah, we rapidly discovered that they're not separate legally or structures. It's a conceptual or perspective.
Of course.
But
it's a very useful concept.
Oh yes, but it took a while because we were trying to create the legal, and it was dissolving. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aliyah. We have a recommendation of yours on our website.
Christiane, can I ask something? Okay. Sorry. I was curious, because you said before that often the operational aspects of attention are the simplest ones, or the organizational ones in general. Like, you get progressively more deep if you go along in the process. Is that true? Did you say? Was that your experience?
Over time it is true. In the beginning, when you do the process for the first time, or maybe the first couple of times, operational space and relational space are really hard, because as a facilitator, people tend to speak from the mixed perspective, and it bugs the hell out of people that the facilitator says, who is we, who is I, can you say from which role you're speaking? And it just gets very frustrating. So holding the process really needs training, good training.
Yeah, that leads to the question I have is, like, once you get to that place where actually in your example, it was as well, like, the operational aspects were relatively simple once you've differentiated them. Actually, from an operational perspective, what I can just do as a circle lead is remove that person from that role and ask someone else to step in. But you will find often that there's something personal preventing you from doing what is operationally needed. And like, what happens then? Like,
well, you can't isolate the perspectives. They're always all there, right? So if I take people through, or whoever takes people through the process, you always have, in 95% of the cases, you have an aspect in each of the perspectives, in each of the spaces. Sometimes you can't write down any next steps in governance space, because you first have to try out what you decided to do in operational to see whether something in the structure needs to be updated or not, right? But there's always something in all spaces, and you need to integrate. That's the differentiation and integration. You need to integrate them all, and then you will, you can, in most cases, if you deal with it on a relational level, and really that is what people mostly do, if they understand the differentiation, suddenly in operational space, you just go and you look for a solution from that, and then it gets really easy.
Thank you.
Yes, hold on. Valerie, would you like to ask that verbally, or shall I just read it?
Okay. I was a little bit unclear, Christiane, about when you were giving the example previously, you talked about a personal situation with somebody. How much of these intervention processes or these tension processes are you operating in group? Because I'm a little bit unclear at the moment where the individual, when you're dealing with the individual, or whether you're dealing with the group. I know from my own experience, I've done both. I've used World Cafe process as a way of working with groups and questioning process there when there are issues, but I've also worked in other organizations where I've tapped into the individuals first at one-to-one meetings, that has then led to a group process that has resolved some of the things. So I just wondered if you could clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's super useful. And as always, there's no one answer to that, because it always depends on where it starts. So from my experience, someone in an organization hears about Language of Spaces and approaches me and says, I would like to have you take me through a process. Or someone, I do mentorship, self-organization mentorship as well, and someone addresses me and says, blah, 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 all this is going on. And then I say, well, that sounds like something we could process with a one-on-one session. So that's like a seed. People come as individuals and then go back into their organizations and do their steps. Normally, it starts with the one-on-one. Then in the organization, there is a decision that clarity between organizational context and people context is necessary. And then you have to work parallel with the organization, building the structures that will allow for that and building the collective. But normally it takes much more attention in the collective than it does in the organization context. If they're already practicing something like, I don't know, sociocracy, holacracy, or something like that, okay? And then you shift into, so what normally happens is that one or two people in the organization get trained as facilitator. And then at the same time, we start integrating that into structuring people context meetings, learning, feedback, and then doing then you can start, you have somebody internally who can be there all the time to help with questions and facilitation. Then you can go into group processes and do. What's very useful is if a group, if there are tensions in the group, you then take circles or teams and take them through a group process of reflection and sharing what they learned from that. But that's a very powerful group process. But it always takes actually to implement and to bring a group of people in an organization to work that way. It's a multifaceted sort of individual, collective, organizational process.